got to get it right.
All right.
I've been there. That's where I pretty much grew up there. So I mean, I know this. I speak from authority.
St. Louis, Wisconsin.
All right.
How are you, Brandon? Good to see you.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you,
Awesome.
Alfonso.
All right. Super nice to see you all in here. Once again, there was a question and answer chat. I know that most of you have probably had a chance to take a look at these prompts already. If you have any questions that you are like, oh, you know what, I was thinking about this, or I had a question about this, then by all means toss it in there. I mean, you know, I'm not an official mouthpiece for the College Board or anything like that, but we can talk about some of these questions that are here that you might actually have. Let me just check out the, I guess the student list, although y'all aren't students, most of you are teachers. There might be some students in here, though. We did extend the invitation. If there are students in here, we appreciate you coming to get really geeky with some English teachers, I guess, for the lack of a better term. Also, Kelly, I know you. I hope you're fine out there in Nevada. Kelly is the person that taught me how to say Nevada and not Nevada a long time ago.
Nigeria.
Nigeria. Wow. Hey, we have gone quite international. Brandon, we might have had a few more people last week, but we did not go as international as this. That's for sure.
This is pretty impressive, you know.
Somebody else from Malaysia up there, Brandon.
It is just, I saw you all talking about that a moment ago. I mean, it's fantastic to see everyone here.
That's awesome.
Oh gosh, I just love it.
And we are grateful. So anyway, let's actually get this started. So my name is Tim Freitas. I am an AP English Language, AP English Literature, Honors English 10, Theology, and also Junior Research Project Coordinator at Whitensville Christian School in Whitensville, Massachusetts. I also run a YouTube channel called The Garden of English, which I'm going to ask that you encourage all your kids to subscribe to, because we are trying to make it to 10,000 subscribers by the end of the school year. We are close. So
what are you going to do, Tim, if you make 10,000 subscribers? What do you? I mean, most YouTube channels I watch, they've got something they do. Now I'm not talking about giveaway. Like, what are you? Shave your head? Dye your hair purple?
You know, maybe I'll put the hair blue for maybe I got to do that, right? We'll do the hair blue for the summer or something like that. That's what I used to do in high school.
Well, but anyway, it is a garden, so green would probably be.
Oh my gosh!
Oh, there we go. Right, so maybe I'll go green for the summer, maybe I'll put that in my next YouTube video. That will go green for the summer if we can reach 10,000 before the end of June. That's that. But anyway, so I'm Tim. Most of you all know my ugly face, and I'm sorry that you have to look at it. I'm even more sorry for my wife, because she stayed so beautiful since high school, and then she just has to look at this every day. But we've got Brandon and we've got Alfonso here. Brandon, why don't you go next? Then Alfonso, tell us a little more about you, and then we'll get the show on the road.
Well, Tim, your wife is lovely, but you know, she needs to realize that choices have consequences, right? And I mean, so she chose you; it was her choice. So
I know.
You almost snarfed, didn't you? You almost snarfed. I saw it.
I did.
I saw it. You know. Anyhow, so hey, everybody. A lot of you, you know, I have been doing things with Tim for a very long time, and I know a lot of you have probably seen me doing some different things. I still teach. Well, I was in the classroom for almost 15 years. I work with teachers now. I still teach at the university level. I work in Cincinnati, Ohio, with the fantastic Cincinnati Public Schools. Just great teachers there. Love them. And they're really dedicated to students and the well-being, but also the minds of those students. And Tim and I worked on the advanced placement language and composition textbook for perfection learning. I actually might pop up one or two things from that tonight as we think about how we might approach some of these. This is not some sort of sales thing for that.
Nope.
That's just, we put our stuff in the book. And so, we'll reference the book. But I'm looking forward to learning with you all and learning from you all as you talk about these different things, and just really excited about this. And I reached out to Tim. I was like, hey, what do you think about just having a talk about these things? And because that's kind of what a lot of us do anyway, is we trade ideas around. And I know I was texting Alfonso just last week about it. So it was great when Tim said, hey, I think Alfonso's going to join us. I'm like, hey, that's awesome. So, and with that, Alfonso, it's all you, sir.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Alfonso Correa, and I teach in Dallas, Texas. Been teaching AP language for 20 years.
What was that? You kind of broke up. I don't know that okay.
Quite a long time, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And excited to be here. I've done some work with Brandon before. Taught with Tim before. Timmy, when did we do? We did Denver a while back, right?
Yeah, we did Denver, and we first met when we did the instructional design team for the new, new course.
So, anyway, I've been involved with AP for quite some time and different capacities, and excited to kind of chat with you all about these questions and see what we can get conversations going. And that always helps us kind of with our own analysis of the questions and our own way and our own methods to kind of analyze them ourselves, and then kind of try to impart that to our students and get them to do some of the same things, right? Depending on, where they are, and kind of finding them, meeting them where they are, and then moving them toward that kind of analysis that we want them to do. So very excited to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting to have you here, Alfonso, because not everybody can be in the room where it happens. Alfonso has been in the room where it happens. Tim and Alfonso have been in the room where it happens with the design of the binders. And so it's nice to be able to reflect on that work and think about these things too. So, I'm really, really excited to get to have these conversations with y'all.
Absolutely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually share the prompts here on the screen. So we'll start talking about them. And just so everybody knows, like when Brandon and Alfonso and I were talking about like, oh, hey, let's have these conversations. We really wanted to be as authentic as possible. So we didn't necessarily come in with anything like planned, like, hey, do this with your class. But the whole point of our conversation is to say, here are ways that we would look at the prompt. Here are ways that we can approach the prompt that can help empower kids, especially maybe even on test day, because they get these cold. And although I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about these prompts, right, I've been able to look at them and process them a little bit. So as we go through these, we'll read them. We'll talk about, potential pitfalls that kids might run into. And then ways to, help kids deal with said pitfalls. And, y'all are, or should I say, at least most of you in here are teachers. Some students might be here to hear us talk about this because we're nerds, but because we're teachers, when you all have like really, things that are really applicable to your classroom, by all means, toss them right in the chat, please. Excuse me. Well, that's what you get for drinking a seltzer. But nonetheless, toss it in the chat because, we want to share ideas here. It doesn't just have to be the Tim, Alfonso, and Brandon show. That wasn't our plan in doing things this way. So anyway, we've got the prompts up here on the screen. We're going to obviously start with synthesis because that is indeed question 1. And I will read the prompt. We're not going to read the sources just because that would take forever. But if anybody, wants to provide some comments on some sources, by all means, put it in the chat. But let's talk about the prompt first. And then Brandon and Alfonso, I'll read it and I'll toss it over to you guys at first to say, what do we think are some of the benefits of the prompt that it offers to us? What are some pitfalls for kids potentially so? And then what are the different ways that kids can really access this? Because I think that's what we try to do. Is try to say, how can we get multiple avenues for kids to access things? So here we go. Since the early 2000s, the United States government and a number of corporations have sponsored initiatives to improve education in the STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The emphasis on STEM subjects in elementary, secondary, and higher education reflects concerns that the United States are less proficient in these areas than our students in other countries. Additionally, there is a belief that mastery in STEM fields is now essential in order to join a highly technical and specialized workforce. However, not everyone is convinced that a STEM-focused curriculum is necessary and/or effective. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops your position on the value, if any, of the initiatives to improve STEM education and increase the number of students interested in the STEM disciplines. So first things first, let's actually try to start with the difficulty and then say, okay, but how does the prompt actually offer kids opportunities? So let's do difficulty.
Can I say something first? Just,
oh yeah, of course.
Because Alfonso's on here. Like Alfonso, this intro part is so long. I can almost hear the conversations in the room. Like, oh, we got to make sure we say this or say, did it strike you or any of your students about the length or the amount of information in here? Not just you, Alfonso, but Tim too.
Yeah, I think it is lengthier than we've seen, I think. And I think and a lot of times when that happens, kind of, as you know, Brandon, it's the almost a necessity to provide more context, right? And these are the questions, right? How much are kids going to be familiar with not only the topic but the context, And then, instead of saying, well, the kids take STEM classes, so no, that's not, that they're not familiar with, what those things mean, the policy and all that. So I think that's why we had a bit lengthier introduction. I don't think it's overbearing or anything like that. I just think it's, kind of that felt necessary to kind of provide that, a little bit broader context for kids. And that should give kids more entry points, right? More opportunities to be able to kind of latch on to things. So that's why I think it's like that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that about entry points, because that was kind of dovetailing. And that's what I was thinking as it dovetails with what Tim was asking about, like how we might, coach our students and things. So Tim, what were your thoughts here? And Kim, I really appreciate you allowing me to co-opt your question.
Thanks. Oh, no. It's not, that's not a problem at all. So, although there's a little bit more length here than we've seen in some of the prior or the more recent ones, I think that the benefit of the length is that it puts a lot of ideas out there for kids. And when I have kids access a prompt, I always tell them when they read this intro element, I want them to really think about the idea words that show up in here, or the words that relate to ideas. And here we've got education, we've got government, we've got the idea of sponsorship, we have initiative. And then when it talks about the other countries, so now we're talking about globalism. So kids can pick a bunch of different ideas from this particular extended setting. Extended intro. When I think about like the space exploration prompt a few years ago, I think that was actually a few years ago. Oh my word, that might have been like 2009. That prompt was very, very short on the intro. So my kids don't have a lot of ideas to grab onto when they go to read their sources. But with an intro like this, I was ecstatic when I saw it. I was like, oh my word, there's plenty of language to grab ideas to, because that helps kids read their sources. If my kids know that the ideas about this prompt are going to relate to education, globalism, and initiative and government, boom, those are the 4 things that they're going to read for in order to bring that in. So those are my ideas. I'm going to check out the chat right now, but that's how that's what I was thinking about in relation to the length of it.
Yeah, I saw a couple of things in the chat insofar as how the questions sometimes and actually maybe even the sources kind of seem like they're pushing in one direction. It's kind of sometimes it's a design thing, not necessarily not design. In other words, we're not trying to deliberately push them in one direction. Those things are most likely dictated by availability of sources, what the developers can find, right? And then, of course, when you find sources, it all depends on whether you can use the source, right? So a lot of times, here's this great source that would provide a different side. Oh, we can't use it. Right, that kind of thing. So let's go find something else that may not be as as big of a contrast. So that those things kind of fall in there. So I think Tim is absolutely right in terms of the kids grabbing on to specific concepts and thinking about them. Because remember, it also is always about the rhetorical situation, right? So they have to think about this big context. So when they're thinking about I use this thing called See It, right? That I absolutely stole from Eva Arce, who's a longtime language teacher down in Austin. And they think about not only questions, prompts, but in this case, sources in terms of their impacts, right? All of these different impacts. And Tim was talking about them, right? The global impact. What's the impact? What's the ethical impact? What's the economic impact, right? So as long as they're starting thinking about that, once again, as Brandon said, right, those are more entry points for them to already start thinking about, now I need to find these things in the sources.
And one of the things that I appreciate what's going on in the chat here is I'm seeing some people that are suggesting that the sources seem to be more biased in one direction, and I appreciate you explaining that out. Like sometimes you can get the best source for the other side, and then all of a sudden you go to secure the copyright for it, and it's like, sorry, no, we're not going to let you have it or use it, or it's too expensive or something like that. But what's nice about this is I have some people in the chat that are like, oh, hey, this definitely seemed pro-STEM, or my kids thought it was incredibly pro-STEM. And then other people are commenting, oh, I actually kind of feel like I saw the sources leaning the other direction. And so I think that kind of helps us recognize that there are multiple avenues in relation to where you can approach this piece from. There were a couple sources where I'm like, oh my word, I could actually use this particular quote for a pro-STEM kind of argument. and not misquote the source. But at the bottom of the source, it was very clearly like, hey, not so fast. And I'm like, ooh, I could put that in a nice little argument that I have. That's like, maybe we should consider more of the humanities, which is exactly what I would have argued, by the way. But somebody,
so I wanted to grab. Go ahead, Tim. You said
no,
something.
you go. No, that's okay. I'll deal with
I was
the
going
chat
to
after.
reference the chat too.
Yep.
So it's the comment Melissa just made here. It's at the bottom. She says, I think biased sources make it an opportunity for critical thinking, a pitfall for simplistic thinking. And Melissa, I like that. I don't know that I would go so far as to call it a pitfall with simplistic thinking for various reasons, but I like it because, Alfonso mentioned how everything, and we all probably know this, but we say it all year long, and we want our students to hear it. And so I'm just going to say it again. It's always about the rhetorical situation. Everything comes back to that. And so when I think about these sources, we think about what kind of conversation are these sources having? What is conversation happening? And so think about grabbing that idea that Tim talked about in the prompt and then saying, okay, what if we're going to talk about this abstraction, what is the conversation that these sources are having about that abstraction? Because I see it going in multiple directions here. I do notice that it looks like the two longest texts, C and E, are both pro humanities. I get that, but then there's some things can go either direction. There's one or two that seem to be not so much anti-humanities, but really STEM. And so I can see it. I see why people say that one way or the other, but I really want to think about the conversation and how we encourage kids to think about these texts in conversation with one another too. Tim?
One of the things that I was also thinking about, I got to address two things from the chat though, too. One of the things I was thinking about here was just the relationship with how kids view STEM, because they do hear STEM a lot. My kids hear it all the time. In fact, every freshman at my high school has to take principles of engineering, and it's always STEM. We have a STEM track and a STEM degree where I work, as part of a way that kids can focus their way through. And so when my kids came back and they were like, yeah, it was super accessible. But if they came back to tell me that it was all pro STEM, I was like, well, that's weird. I actually think that you're pro STEM, and I'm glad that your argument, dealt with that. But I think that they then kind of read those elements into their sources, which is something that we obviously try to teach them not to. But in a high pressure situation, you can't just leave yourself at the door. You got to be able to get in there and access it. Just a couple things here. There was a question in the Q&A panel, which somebody asked me about. Can I extrapolate, or should I say expound upon the idea of reading for idea words? And because I don't want to take up too much time, because we want to go through all three of the prompts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just open up a new tab here real quick. And I'm going to just post a YouTube video where I cover exactly how to read a synthesis prompt. So Garden of English synthesis. Okay. And this just shows you how to break down the prompt for ideas. And then that can help kids actually read. So this is the video right here. So the person that asked that, I'm going to put that right in the chat for you. And you can check that out. It's not a very long video. It's probably like a 8-minute video. So that is there. Just so that we can continue to move on throughout the night. So please forgive me. But there was
the most important thing you just said there, though, and I won't expound on this, but the most important thing you said at the very beginning is that sometimes these ideas are in the prompt.
Yeah.
And that's what's important to find, is that's what kids can grab onto, is the abstract ideas that are in the prompt itself is usually, and that's not just true of the synthesis question. Go ahead, Tim.
I think an important point, to respond to a couple of things that are in the chat about kids who aren't familiar with STEM programs per se, and that really kind of push those things in various schools. There and somebody mentioned that the context is really helpful for those kids, and that's true. And I think going forward, just kind of making sure that your students know that's why the really critical, careful reading of the context, right, of the background for this topic is really important for them. So, and anything and everything that would be completely unfamiliar. For example, eminent domain, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
That's almost always, and I think always has been defined in the very first sentence, right? And then there's context, right? So, but it's important for them to pay attention to that, right? And make sure that they catch that. And Tim's talk about those idea words, right? Then it's easier for them to see those idea words, right? And kind of start extrapolating those ideas and then inform those with the sources. So,
right. And so, a couple questions in the chat about responding to this prompt, right? One of them says that, that this person felt like the sources were well balanced, and they seem to point to the fact that, perhaps both types of sides could receive incentives or initiatives. And is that an appropriate way to respond to this prompt? If a student were to argue that that there is value in STEM incentives or initiatives, but also there should be just as much value in let's say humanities initiatives, what would you say about that, Alfonso? If that showed up on your table during the exam reading, a kid's arguing, hey, there is value here, but there's also a lot more value if we provide initiatives that also produce pairing this with the humanities. What do you think about that?
I think that would be would be acceptable. A couple of reasons why. Because it does think about the broader context, which is nice. But also, of 2 or 3 of the sources do that, right? As we were mentioning earlier, right? A couple of the sources kind of embed this. Hey, STEM is really important, but right, almost smack dab in the middle of them, it says not at the expense. And I think one of them specifically says not at the expense of humanities, that kind of thing, right? So that gives us, should give our students, right, that kind of nuanced idea, right? That it's a lot of times, most of the time, not a yes or no, right? Not a black and white. So if they start thinking that way, then kind of creating the argument that way gives them even more, entry points to use. And again, you got to be able to control that, right? Not just say, hey, this is this, and so, but in a controlled way, it really, really is a nice way for them to access essentially more ideas, which is nice.
Right. And I think that's the big thing. I know that when I work with students a lot and when I work with new AP teachers, a lot of times, but it's more students than newer AP English teachers. A lot of times students are like, well, how do I actually get into this prompt? And I'm like, no. What is your argument in relation to this prompt? Like they want this kind of strict, hey, do it this way, dive in here, argue pro STEM and move on. And I'm like, listen, if there's nuance here, I mean, think about how nuanced and sophisticated an argument could be, right? If it were, hey, these initiatives are great and there's plenty of value in there because it's going to build jobs. But if we also make initiatives for the humanities, which are, in some places seemingly neglected, then perhaps we could actually build a better global community. That's a really cool argument that discusses the necessity of STEM initiatives and then pairs it with something bigger. So there is some nuance there, but I don't think that every kid can necessarily think about that in under the pressure of the AP exam. So the kid who's like, boom, there's value. The value is it going to create more jobs. Awesome. And then moves on. That paper can do just as fine as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't need to say anything else about it, except that if you are doing this in your classroom next year, and you feel like the students are vacillating too much, like it's not clear, then the coachable moment is that they need to be more clear because, of course you guys as Lang readers too, I would love to hear what you think, but my concern is that they do vacillate and it gets ambiguous. So in the classroom, we have an opportunity to help students clean that up a little bit. I don't want it to oversimplify. But it can be a complicated topic, but it's our job, as writing teachers to make sure that it is clear there. And that probably goes without saying. So, but I think when it says develop your position on the value, and there's the, if any, that is going to give students an opportunity to branch out from that. That's going to get that on that's going to get that through and value the argument of it. And that's why we changed from that old language of defend, challenge, or qualify. We want to say, hey, just develop your position, make your argument. So
that's a great point, Brandon. I think, and that whole qualify thing, and we kind of still talk about that a little bit, but as we often say, for the purposes of scoring, right, for the purposes of the exam, right, that takes a little bit more time and a little bit more thinking. And I would tell my students that when the qualify, because that's always attractive, right? I can just do both. I can talk about more stuff. Well, that's great, but that takes a lot of balance, right? It takes a lot more care to kind of do that. So it's really important for them to, in this case, you can develop a position on the value of something, right? Whether it has value, right? And once again, it doesn't necessarily have to be yes or no, right? But clear, right? That position has to be clear. So that helps, right? It helps kids kind of discern those things and make sure they got them straight in their head. So as they go into creating the argument, they're already looking for the appropriate evidence, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
One other thing about the prompt here, because we're talking about the idea of the value and whatnot. First of all, somebody just tossed an awesome idea in the chat, which is like, get kids synonyms to move, to kind of make the idea of value a little bit more concrete, even though it's going to be abstract no matter what. But the synonyms here would be the importance, the significance, right? And that might really help kids be able to access this a little bit more. But one of the things that I do, and I make my kids do this all throughout the year. This is something that I absolutely force. Brandon's probably so sick of hearing me say this. Alfonso, I'm not sure if you've ever heard me say this, but you probably have because I say it too much. But I always have the kids go to the verb in the prompt, and I'll also do this with the argument prompt and the rhetorical analysis prompt in a little bit. But I always make them find the verb that never changes. And in this case, it's going to be develops. So every synthesis prompt from now on, it's going to say develops. And I make them underline to the end of their sentence. And then I ask them, before you even read the sources or anything, what can't you know? And it has to be the word what, because what is a very easy question to answer. We ask why, we ask how, and that's going to be a lot more of a longer question. I need the what's here. And I say, what can't you know? And if they look, they're like, well, we know we're talking about STEM disciplines. We know that we're talking about STEM initiatives, but what is the value of a STEM initiative in education? And now my kids have that question to answer. And I'm like, if your thesis does not articulate what the value is, so they're not allowed to just say there's value in STEM education. They have to articulate what the value is. Is it going to create a stronger global economy? Is it going to create a more well-rounded citizen? Is it going to create more jobs? Maybe it's a mixture of both. Then at that point, you have answered the prompt, which we know AP stands for, not agony and pain or anxiety and pressure, right? And sure enough, just creating that what question typically can help lower the kid's ability to approach, lower the kid's affective filter when approaching the prompt, because they have a what question to answer and not a why or a how yet. That's what body paragraphing is for, but the what will be answered in their thesis. So just a little tip there for people that are looking for ways to kind of help kids access that prompt as well.
So I'm gonna very intentionally shift us with a terrible segue and a bad transition. Just to be clear, you can't coach this. I mean, it's bad. I just want to know because of time and things, because everything you just said, Tim, is great, and we could really get into the pedagogy and teaching of this, but we also wanted to have time to talk about these different prompts, if you don't mind. So I want to kind of wrap it up with this. I'd love to hear from you guys, and you all can drop in the chat. Everybody take a second and look at the sources, and I'd like to hear from you, Tim, and hear from you, Alfonso. And I promise everybody, we have not talked about this ahead of time. They don't even know what I'm about to ask. They're probably scared. And I want to say, as you look at the sources, what's the one you're going to grab and be like, oh, that's the one? And then what's the one you're going to run away from? Like, oh, can't use that. Not using that at all. So take a moment, look at it, see what you think.
Well, I should probably put the link in the chat so people can check that out. Also, Brandon and Alfonso, if you want to check out that Q&A and answer those questions while people are potentially looking at the source, scrolling through, you can answer those if you'd like.
Let me see here.
Because I do talk too much and I know that, so forgive me, please.
No, it was great. like I said in the chat there, I said, you can't, the thing you said that I was probably tired of hearing you say, I was like, you can't say it enough. It's so important. Yeah, I'm just blown away by some of these great ideas that people are sharing here.
Yeah.
So the prompt, the source that I loved and that I would use in my classroom to show students that they could do so much with it and they could interpret it in different ways is source D. That's this chart here, because it can be argued so many different ways.
Yeah.
And I would talk to students and say, this is where you can't just say, well, this chart says this, because it doesn't just say one thing. If you look at the bottom where it says that knowledge of global cultures and et cetera is not that important, you could say, oh, well, the humanities aren't important because I don't need to know that stuff. But the humanities are where you get to learn ethical judgment and integrity too. So I thought this was a really great source. And then the source that I would run from Screaming was the source C, only because it starts with Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin, and that was a name I was hoping I would never ever see again for the rest of my life. So that's my only political comment of the night. Sorry.
All right. I know that actually a lot of kids did jump on source C, at least on Twitter, because on Twitter they were always like Asian studies, or was that what he was doing down here?
Yeah. Matt Bevin said the humanities are not important in STEM, and he has a degree in East Asian studies.
Yeah. Now the questions in here, right? Is one of them is, and we'll try to answer these questions quickly, and then we'll shift to question 2, just because, we're going to try to keep this within the hour. But just if we go to the question and answer tab, what about approaching this from an international perspective? So let's pretend the kids now they didn't get this exam internationally. They got a different exam. But if they were to, should they bring in their international perspectives into this, because these sources are predominantly, K-12 USA?
Yeah.
So if I'm teaching this in my classroom, how should I encourage the kids to deal with this?
I think there are ways to approach it from an international perspective, because there are some things in the sources that mention, what things are happening internationally. But so that's, that would be fair game, right? And I think in kind of, situating those things, and you're right, this would not be on an international exam, because it says the United States government, so that would be unfair for
Right.
international students. But I think even so, if kids had knowledge of international schools, or how those things are really kind of paid attention to, what's happening, and those I don't remember if it's data or dimensions of how kids are doing on an international scale, that kind of thing. If you want to bring those things in, I think that's fair game, right? In terms of, and maybe, and that's where the commentary happens, right? That's where the explanation happens. That's where you kind of connect it and say, hey, all these other countries are moving ahead of us, so on and so forth. So it does absolutely demonstrate the value of, continuing to pursue STEM in this country, that kind of thing. Right. So when it's fleshed out in their commentary like that, then it's relevant.
Yeah. I love that comment, because and thinking about a student writing, let's say a student's writing about this, and this is on an international exam. Let's say it was, and a student's writing about it in Germany, and they're saying, well, why are they doing this in the United States? Like German, we have great engineering programs and things here in Germany, maybe. And why are we, and we don't have this kind of emphasis here, and it's all just general education. Thinking about students writing about it from different countries, whether it be Germany, whether it be India, whether it be Nigeria. I mean, they could easily do that, I think, almost as a criticism of what the U.S. is doing, or the other way around, praising, saying, oh, I wish we had more of that here, because we're trying to compete as well. But I agree with you, Alfonso. I think it's probably not an international exam prompt.
One more comment about this, then we'll move on to question 2. The question here is this, right? What if kids didn't actually address the idea of initiatives, but just address the idea of STEM education in general. Is that going to be fair game when it comes to test time?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's and I saw this other question really quick that kind of sort of goes along with it.
Yep.
Kind of in development of those of the questions like that. It's absolutely fair game, I would say, because it's the when you look at the prompt itself, right? It says the value of STEM education, not the value of STEM initiatives. So there's wiggle room a little bit in there, but I think that gives them the avenue, right? And I think that's deliberate. But anyway, and somebody asked about when the question was written in development, and we won't kind of dwell on this, but it takes a while for questions to be developed and then show up on an exam, just because processes and permissions and all that kind of good stuff. So, and then the right time, not in terms of time, but when exams are put together, there are lots of parameters, so on and so forth. So, this question that's sitting here may have sources that are too long, for example, right? And we have a really lengthy rhetorical analysis prompt. Oh, let's not do that to kids, right? Let's find another one, right? So it all depends, right? So yeah, sometimes you're most likely going to get sources that are about 2, 3, sometimes a little bit longer, years old. But that's a process thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, all right, let's check out question 2. I'll read the prompt, and then I'll let you guys talk about accessing said prompts and whatnot. Or accessing the prompt, and we're not going to read the reading, of course, but there are a couple things we could talk about here. And so here we go. Born in New York City to Puerto Rican parents, Sonia Sotomayor was appointed a United States Supreme Court justice in 2009. Becoming the first Latina justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. She delivered a speech, A Latina Judge's Voice, at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law in 2001 when she was an appeals court judge. The following passage is an excerpt from that speech. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Sotomayor makes to convey her message about her identity. All right, Brandon and Alfonso, take it away.
I like this prompt.
Yeah, you go ahead, Alfonso. I was going to say you should go.
And it gives kids, because that's pretty much all she's talking about, right? Is how all of these different things in her life contributed to her identity. So there's lots to grab onto for students. So then the focus becomes there once again. What do those choices mean, right? Not only, of course, what are they, but how, right? How do they impact, right, her message about her identity, right? So then it's nice to have, and again, the language is accessible, I think, relatively accessible, it's nice. It's a really kind of nice read, that kind of thing. There's lots of entry points for kids to kind of latch onto here. So I really like this prompt.
Yeah, I think they're from the beginning, you talk about those choices from the very beginning, who am I, to the very last sentence where she talks about loving, loving being a Puerto Rican, and to love America at the same time. It's clear every single choice here. I mean, I cannot wait for teachers to get to use this in their classroom, because, and I don't mean for a practice exam, I mean for really digging into it, because it's clear that every choice here supports this. And I always, if there's anything Tim gets tired of me saying, it's, the first thing I want my students to see is where's the shift. And
Yep.
and line 41 now. And then she asks a question that we all know the answer to. And so I just love, there you go, right there on it. And so I love the way this is all structured, the way this is all put together. Also, a shout out to College Board for, I think this is the first time I can remember, and Alfonso, Tim, correct me if this is wrong. This is the first time I can ever remember that on the Lang exam and the literature exam, the text for analysis are all by people of color. We have Jimmy Santiago Baca on the poetry for literature, and then we have Linda Hogan, who is Native American. I forget which tribe, but she's the storyteller. She is the storyteller for her tribe.
Yeah, I knew that.
And then we have this from Sonia Sotomayor. I mean, I think it's a real shot across the bow when College Board politically can't make a statement about voices necessarily in classrooms, but then this is what they release.
And then you know what? Colin Powell was the person for question 3.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, I forgot. Yeah, I did. Absolutely. That hadn't even crossed my mind, but you're absolutely right. And so, I mean, that's really something. And kudos to College Board for that. I'm not trying to suck up to them. I'm not trying to get a job there. I had that job, but I really do think that is huge. So,
yeah.
Tim, how did your students respond to this prompt?
So I didn't. They came in and they were like, it was fine. I didn't go over the prompts with my students at all. So when they were released, I was like, oh, hey guys, hey, this is cool. These prompts are accessible. But I didn't actually go through and talk about what they did or did not, because we only have a couple of weeks left. And I was like, we got to get that last project out. Right.
Sure.
Just in relation to the prompt super quick. One of the things that I really appreciate is how it talks about the rhetorical choices makes to convey her message about her identity. Now, this is really important to me because when my kids read this, I'm going to have some kids who are not my strongest readers who are going to really just talk about how she identifies with her family heritage throughout the whole piece. And they can actually write her familial heritage, right? As that's part of her, even though she's an American. And I guess I shouldn't say, no, that's part of what makes her the American that she is. That's how I should have worded that. But nonetheless, I could have a kid that can read it very much with just that moment. But I can have another student who can notice the nuance there that reflects on this idea that though she is an American, right, she's also very much Latina. And then put that kind of nuance there as she projects her message. So I've got a very manageable paper for the kid who can only see the weight that she puts on her Latina heritage. And then for the student that can understand that kind of tension and nuance of being the American, the New Yorker, and the Puerto Rican Latina, that kid can write that stronger paper too, but they can both produce really strong papers, as opposed to sometimes the prompt will kind of push kids in one direction and potentially, limit where they can go. I think about the Florence Kelly piece where it's like about her message about child labor, when really there was a lot in there too about, women's voting rights. Some kids could really, really miss that. But this one is nice and open. And I'm like, oh, that was so cool for my kids that might struggle and my kids who are really going to pick up that nuance. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
Yeah. There's somebody who made the comment over here in the chat that they prefer the ones where the purpose is more clear, or it says, the just message about identity. And I understand that. I do. There was a real push to have that be more clear here sometimes with certain prompts. Think of it this way, though. The positivist way of thinking about it is that this gives more of an open understanding of the passage, an opportunity to be analyzed.
Yeah.
So students may say, oh my gosh, I've got to figure out what the identity of I've got to figure out what her message is. Well, her message, it could be so broad as her message about her identity, her message about self. That's not the point here. The point is that students be able to find choices that and talk about how those choices do it. But I really have to highlight what Tiffany says in the chat. Shout out to Tiffany. I'm going to read it word for word if I can find it again. If somebody else finds it before I do, let me know, because I just like yeah, exactly, Tim. It says, my sense is that students were still trying to scavenge for devices. The students who were still trying to scavenge for devices seem to struggle, as opposed to those students examining for larger choices, moves, or shifts. I completely agree with that. I saw a teacher on Twitter who was really upset. She was saying, there were no there were no choices in there. She was just talking. It was a teacher saying that. And I had good Twitter discipline. I didn't reply, but I wanted to say, what I wanted to say was, well, then they weren't looking for choices. They were probably looking for named devices.
Yeah.
But what we really want to get across, and this is in the CED, everyone, it's in the CED. Everything a writer chooses to do in a text is for, say it with me, the rhetorical situation, and they've made that choice. Just like Tim's wife chose to marry him. Choices have consequences.
Those consequences. That's right.
I know, right? Words matter here. And so I love Tiffany's comment because I think it's absolutely true. If you've got people who are still playing the old battleship where here's the metaphor, here's the image, and here's some hyperbole, they're not going to get that so much here. I'm going to get a much richer essay that talks about a choice is her decision to focus on food, because she does it in different places. And there's so much that can be said about culture and food. But that's not just giving it a name like you would a device. I'm done.
Yeah. Yeah. And, what's nice about that is, look at this. You could just start with the very first sentence. She begins by asking a question.
Yeah.
Right. And now kids who have an astute, rhetorical vocabulary would be like, oh, she begins by using hippophora, right? But it's like, who cares? I was a rhetoric major in college, and I did just fine in college in my undergrad, and I never once heard the word hippophora until I was at the reading in 2015, and a kid wrote about it, and I'm like, what the garbage is hippophora? You know?
Well, if we're pulling out nerd words, then I love the fact that in that first sentence, and kids would never have to use this word.
Yeah.
Okay. But in that second sentence, I would be happy if my student just talked about her combining of the words New York and Puerto Rican into New York Rican to indicate how she identifies with both, and maybe linking it to the last sentence where she calls herself a Puerto Ricana.
Oh, yeah.
And a New Yorker. And an American. But if a kid says, well, that's a portmanteau, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. Good for you. Right. But you're not going to get any credit if you don't talk about how it works.
That's right.
Alfonso, didn't you marry a Puerto Ricana?
I did. And just for context, New Yorkers generally are much more Puerto Rican than Puerto Ricans born in Puerto Rico.
Say more.
It's just, I had a friend in the Navy who was New Yorican, and my gosh, he was the most nationalist guy I've ever met in my whole life. Right. Puerto Rico to the death. And so when I met my wife, and found out she was from Puerto Rico, I expected some of the same. Not so much. That place kind of mellows you. And having visited with our children it's just awesome. So but again, it's the mixture of it. And a lot of folks were mentioning this in the chat, right? Where she's combining things, right? And that's a choice, right? Where she combines all these things from two different places, even in her own family. And those things are really, really, really ripe for kids to be able to talk about their effect, right? How does that contribute to her identity, right? Well, and the fact is that it all does, and that's awesome, right? So it's when she talks about that kind of and thinking about a little bit in terms of broader context, for example, right? We call New York the great melting pot, kind of, So a bit of a slight discussion about that, right? And how it's part of who she is, right? That's there's just so much stuff. It's awesome.
Yeah.
One other thing here, and this is just a comment that Janet's students made, and I actually, in my mind, I agree with this, and this is not me being hypercritical, or I'm not trying to be or come off that way, but it talks about it just being a speech that was delivered at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And Janet's students were like, they wish that they just got a little bit more of the context about that speech. Was it like, what type of an address was it? Because that could have probably helped a little bit more with identifying purpose, because clearly this message is meant, the message part here is to deal with the message of the piece. but then that kind of purpose element which leads to like, okay, so what is the audience going to do with this message? If they had a little bit more context, they would have been able to address that kind of, all right, what does the audience do with this besides the fact that they know about somebody who's pretty important now, or should I say who's really important now? And so I can empathize with the students there on that one. Knowing if it was a commencement or knowing if it was just like what kind of address it was might have been a little bit more helpful, but nonetheless, it's a completely accessible piece, and pinpointing the idea about the message the message about the identity is strong here.
Just one last thing there, Tim, about what you just said in terms of the audience versus the writer's choices. And somebody mentioned that in the chat earlier. And I always tell my students, look, it's a little bit easier to describe and discuss the writer's intent, right?
Yep.
What the writer is trying to do, because that's the evidence you have,
yeah.
Right? Versus how the audience reacts, right? Unless, as you were just talking about, you have very specific information about that audience, right? It's really difficult to tell, right? And make kind of blanket statements about, well, the audience is going to think this. Maybe some of them, you want to be really precise there versus, the writer's trying to do this, and this is why. This is why I see this, because they're employing this appeal. They're employing this type of language, and so you have the evidence, right? So it's a little bit easier to do that.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that this isn't completely accessible. I'm just saying that in my world, I'm always like, what do we know about that audience? You got to dress up like them and figure out how you got to move, but I completely understand. Brandon also just tossed a comment in the chat, which is just absolutely money. This is a great piece for teaching the college essay. Wow. Yeah, I didn't even think about it that way. Brandon, you win. You win for the night. There's your mic drop.
Well,
we might as well pack up.
But think about it. As a mentor piece for personal essay writing, and thinking about the choices that they make in their essay. And college essays probably aren't going to be this long, but you get it. You see the voice here. You see the uniqueness here. And I think
you see the transformation too. Like you see, just starting with a question, even though it's answered right away, but what does this actually mean? I mean, this is defined throughout. Oh, yeah, you bet.
Yeah. So I'm going to have to be that guy and say we need to at least give some, verbal justice to the argument prompt.
Yeah. All right. So this seems to be the one that has caught the most flack in the online community. I will read it. I'll send it off to you guys for a couple of minutes. I'll address one quick thing and then we'll see where we got to be. But here we go. Colin Powell, a 4-star general and former United States Secretary of State, wrote in his 1995 autobiography, "We do not have the luxury of collecting information indefinitely. At some point, before we can have every possible fact in hand, we have to decide. The key is not to make quick decisions, but to make timely decisions." Write an essay that argues your position on the extent to which Powell's claim about making decisions is valid. All right. Brandon and Alfonso, take it away, and then I'll put in a couple things here.
I worry that kids are going to struggle with differentiating between quick decisions and timely decisions.
Yes, I think so. I agree.
Because honestly, I have, I got a PhD in English, and I struggle. I really have to stop and think what the difference is. Go ahead, Alfonso. Sorry.
I think, and again, just kind of definition kind of thing, right? So quick is snap decision versus timely and timely means, because of the prior context, right? Sometimes you have to make decisions when you don't have the information, right? That it means you still have to make the decision, right? So that's kind of the difference, and so when I was kind of looking at this and writing about it and thinking about it, and some of my kids were kind of helping me and say, well, snap versus, informed, or they said actually uninformed versus informed. And a bunch of kids, yes, that's really kind of one of the big differences here. And you can really kind of work with that, right? So definition has a lot to do. Context, right? I saw some discussion about, well, no, the kids don't know who Colin Powell is. Well, once again, right? Just like eminent domain, these things are defined, right? So, when we know that Colin Powell is a 4-star general and former U.S. Secretary of State, right? The critical thinking process should kick in, right? And say, well, this is a guy who makes big decisions, right? So whether or not he has the authority, right? There's the context, right? About where are these decisions and what his position on making decisions is, right? So I agree that it's not obtuse, right? Because again, there's a lot of care that goes into making sure that that's not a thing, right? So, and I get it. People, a lot of the kids were upset, and I didn't know what timely was. Well, okay, but you got to work in the rest of the context. And as Tim and I were talking briefly, there's a lot of other things about making decisions, right? And that's what the question is actually about, right? Claim about making decisions, right? So you could develop your own position about that on various different things, right? A quick thing about, for example, things in quotations or in context and versus what's in the task, right? I think both of you guys will remember this. A few years ago when we had the polite speech prompt, right? There were some examples in the prompt, right? Polite words like "How are you?" or whatever.
Yeah.
And we saw generally that the better essays really focused on the idea of polite speech and kind of fleshing that out and using examples of that. And a lot of the weaker ones focused on the examples that were in the prompt, right? And stayed there. So again, kind of broadening out, and again, once again, it's all about the rhetorical situation. I think thinking about that a little bit differently, once again, provides those entry points for kids where they can really, really start thinking about, hey, what are the different types of decisions here, right? So if I think about that, and again, like I said, I use it with my kids. Think about all these different contexts, right? All these different impacts, right? Local, moral, ethical, economic, right? College decisions, right? These kids are making college decisions, right? Making a uninformed versus an informed one, that kind of thing, and that gives them a lot more access to more examples, right? More evidence.
And I almost want to say, first, I've got to say, I love Liz, and she says one of my kids used the example of the boys trapped in that flooded cave in Thailand and the decisions the divers had to make. Oh, that's a great analogy. That's really good. Yeah. I really appreciate, and I could spin out the whole essay on that.
For sure.
But I really want to say, I understand everyone asking about this context. I agree with what Alfonso just said. I wish it just said, some guy once said, we do not have the luxury of this, because kids are going to get, if they know who Colin Powell is, they might get into discussing him, but that's not the point. I want to know the kids' argument. And so, in Alfonso, again, and Tim and I have talked about this too with the book, do we list who said this? Because it's going to shade, if Hillary Clinton said this or Donald Trump said it, these essays are going in different directions. Yeah. And that's not the point here. And it's hard for me to get that across to some of my students. And I'm glad we're having this discussion about it, because I don't want students to hang on the fact that they don't know who Colin Powell is. Like somebody said that they thought he was a philosopher because he said this. Colin Powell's a smart guy. He didn't make necessarily the best decisions sometimes, but we all make, he was a smart guy who got put into some situations where he had to make decisions, and he made them and he stood by them. We've all been there, just at different levels. So anyway, Tim.
Go, Alfonso. You talk, and then I'm going to just address some of the concerns that I've seen and ways to kind of alleviate this in the classroom for next year, especially for teachers that are like, hey, if my kids came back really struggling, what can I do? But Alfonso, you first.
Yeah, no, to kind of piggyback on what Brandon was saying about the difference between the quotation. Some folks are mentioning that in the chat as well. The difference between what's in the context, what's in the quotation, and what is in the task, right? I always tell my students, laser focus on that task, right? And we can show them different examples, right? Even this one, right? Well, of course, this one does mention Powell's claim, but focus on the claim, right? Not on Powell, right?
This is one of those rare prompts, Alfonso, where they don't, I often tell people you can draw a line between the intro and the prompt or the
Yeah.
task, and you don't need to even look above it. This
Yeah.
one you can't.
Not really. Not really. Because
it would have been nice if it said argues your position on the importance of on the difference between quick decisions and timely decisions.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
you know what? And kind of thinking back, Brandon, and you've been in 100 of these discussions. I would say maybe folks said, a lot of kids aren't going to know who Colin Powell is, so it's not a big deal who Colin Powell is, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. But again, it's still about, again, that laser focus, right? The claim, right? You focus on the claim. What is that claim? About making decisions, right? So that's what we really, really, really have to help kids to focus on. And then, hey, yes, we can think about the context. We can think about who said it. Maybe if I know who it is, maybe I can use that as an example, right? That could work. But if we focus much more on the actual task, I think it really, really, really helps kids to focus. And then, makes it easier, right? To kind of avoid some of the pitfalls.
Well, I like what Jason said over in the chat. And so about the discussion about it being, it created a binary between quick and timely. But, even though I said I think students are going to struggle with that quick decisions versus timely decisions, I want to backtrack on that a little bit because I'm really looking forward to seeing these essays because kids are usually smarter than we think they are. And I think there's going to be some kids who really draw some nuanced, clever, smart distinctions between these things. And so I'm really looking forward to reading those essays. And that's my comment. I'm done for now, Tim. Call you, brother.
So basically, just a couple of things here in relation to some of the, I guess, qualms that people have had is number one, people are like, oh, whatever happened to the stable prompt wording and blah, blah, blah. This is stable prompt wording because the stable prompt wording from the CED says that every argument will start with write an essay that argues your position on. Mm-hmm. So I think that some people are not thrilled with the idea that it says the extent to which Powell's claim, on the extent to which Powell's claim about making decisions is valid. But this is the part that's the stable prompt wording. It's still there. It's entirely stable. This part's not. However, when it comes to teaching your kids about argument, and I talk about the same type of question that we did with synthesis, we can do it with rhetorical analysis. We can do it here. You find that verb argues and you say, what can't you know? Because this has to be articulated in your thesis. You have to, what can't you know yet? You can't know Powell's claim without interpreting this quote. And then you have to also say, do I think it's valid? So both of those elements need to be in the thesis. Now, you don't need to say Powell made the claim in your thesis, but you have to at least address what the claim is. Now, what makes this nice is that if my kids do this and they say, okay, what is Powell's claim? I might have some kids that totally ignore this sentence right here. And they actually focus on this one because this is a claim too. At some point, before we can have every possible fact in hand, we have to decide. That claim is a claim about making decisions, and your kids can write that essay instead. That essay is significantly easier than this essay. But in my classroom, when I teach argument writing folks and I use past AP exam prompts, I always try to vary it up where there are some prompts where kids have to interpret the quote correctly and other ones where they don't. And that's the first thing we ever do in my classroom is we say, is this a prompt where you have to interpret the quote or not? Or is it one that you don't actually need it at all? And so that my kids always know that there are two types. And that might be something that you want to consider doing with your kids this year, especially if they seem to struggle with the idea of having to interpret Powell's claim when they recognize like, oh, crud, I didn't realize I had to use the quote anymore. So just a couple things to consider here, because when you have this element of Powell's claim, you could pull anything from in here. He makes a claim. We don't have the luxury of collecting information indefinitely. Now that right there doesn't actually deal with decisions, so we can't use that one. But these two down here, you can go a lot of ways with that. So I wanted to just toss that out there for some comments about that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think really, if we think about encouraging kids to think about context, right? Think about the rhetorical situation. That first statement paired with the second statement, right? That's intentional, right? We do not have the luxury of collecting information infinitely. At some point, it's a continuation of that thought. Right?
Yeah,
at some point, before we can have every possible fact in hand, we have to decide. Focus on that. right? That is his
Yeah.
claim about making decisions, right? That is one of the claims. And that's not necessarily, once again, to trip up kids. But as a matter of fact, I would say that this guy, as Tim was saying, exactly what Tim was saying, gives them more opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. So we could take more comments in the chat. And if Brandon Alfonso, if you have anything else that you want to add, now that we're wrapping up, please note, folks, that Brandon and I do run. Actually, Alfonso does too. We all are doing APSIs at some point for the College Board this summer. I know that I'll be at TCU. Alfonso, are you at TCU this year?
I am.
Okay, so Alfonso's at TCU. He's in a couple other places. Brandon is too. Brandon and I also do AP workshops for. Oh, sorry, we have to call them Garden of English as AP workshops. Those are online, and we could toss a link in the chat there as well, just so you can, you might want to consider spending some time with us there. But we appreciate you, Brandon and Alfonso. Any other final comments about accessing this question 3 as we begin to wrap things up?
I think this is a great prompt to help students start to unpack things that can be confusing. Not just before they begin to develop or form their claim. So they have to unpack, what it really means first, and then they develop their claim. I think it's a great way to do that. So many of the prompts push you into just making a choice one way or the other.
Hey, I have to ask you guys a quick question before you all leave. So, Alfonso, there was a question in here. It says, will we see you all at the reading? Alfonso, what are you doing at the reading this year?
I am taking care of the bananas at the reading.
You bet. Okay, we will have bananas at
the job. Brandon didn't seem to think I did a good enough job one year when I was a question leader, so I'm trying to redeem myself.
What? No, that is not true. That is patently untrue.
I know. I'm going to be Tim. I'm going to be the assistant chief reader this year. One of them, actually. We have 2. So it's pretty exciting. I think it's going to be pretty exciting. So hopefully, we'll see you guys there. It's really pretty exciting to be back in person.
Well, I will be at the lit reading instead.
what?
I'm sorry. Wait. I'm sorry. What?
Those other people.
Did he say lit?
I think so.
I did.
No, he said the AP Lang reading is lit, like it's awesome. That's what he said. That's what I heard.
No, I chose.
I had to choose billboards posted to kind of tell people what Brandon's location is. I have
to do the lit reading just because of the way it lines up time wise. I wanted to go to Lang first this year because I some of you all know I do both, but it just timeline wise didn't work out. So I will be doing the lit reading, but I'm really excited about it. And normally I'm always pulling for question 3, but I liked the passages, all 3 passages, so much this year. I would be happy to do any.
You definitely owned it with the lit passages this year for sure. Like the whole lit exam is my favorite that they've ever released. There's no doubt about. Well, the questions at least. And I am actually an early. I'm a sample selection table leader, so I'll be down there early.
So you and Alfonso are going to get another week to hang out.
Yeah, and did TCU. I mean, Alfonso, this is great.
Yeah, I'll have to have you over to the house, man.
Hey, I'm excited. I'm excited to get down there. That'd be great. So Brandon, Alfonso, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you so much. Folks, thank you for coming in and hanging out with us. There are some cool things that are going on at the Garden of English. You're going to want to check that out. But this was for you, so we could talk. We'll post it on YouTube, and we'll get this conversation up there. Brandon, Alfonso, you all have a great night, okay?
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, everyone else.
Thanks, everyone.
I'm going to stop recording. Courtney, I will answer your question. We don't